Let's take a look at how the markets fared on Friday during the trading session. We did see the NGX end Friday's trading session in the positive trend. We saw the market, of course, up by 0.25%, with the all-share index hitting 72,230 points. The market's capitalization, of course, hit 39.18 trillion. We have seen the market sustain the bearish or the bullish trend, I beg your pardon, in quite a while now, and that didn't come as a shock on Friday. And the volume of trade that exchanged hands on the floor of the exchange on Friday hit 582.76 million. The value of trades on Friday hit 4.270 billion naira, and about 6,874 deals exchanged hands on the floor of the NGX on Friday. And now to the gainers table, where we did see NSL Tech hit take the lead on the table as the top stock with the highest levels of gains on Friday. We saw it up by 10.0%, followed by Mikio, which has sustained its place, I must say, on the gainers chart for quite a while now. We've seen Mikio on this table since it was listed on the floor of the exchange. It was up by 9.90%, and NIMET followed next with a 9.85% on the gainers chart. And on the flip side, let's move on to the losers table, where we did see Tom's Way, of course, hit its place as the lowest with the biggest of losses on Friday's trade, down by over 44.39%. And I must say that is a very big, huge loss, which was seen on the market on Friday, followed by ABC Transport, which was down by 9.68%, and C Leasing was also on the losers chart, down by 8.98%. And next, we move on to the top trades and market movers. On Friday, we did see Veritas Capital Assurance have about 107 million shares, making its place as the stock with the highest level of trades expected which was had on the floor of the exchange on Friday, followed by Universal Insurance, which hit 96.1 million shares. Unity Bank followed suit with about 44.9 million shares. And there you have it, the top trades and market movers from Friday's trading session. And now to the sectoral performance on Friday, where we did see the NGX banking grow by 1.62%. We saw the NGX industrial remain unchanged from trade on Thursday, and NGX consumer goods also ended in the green, up by 0.95%. NGX oil and gas, on the other hand, also remained unchanged, just like we did see with the NGX industrial. And lastly, NGX insurance ended the day in the negative, down by 0.62%. And now to the African region, let's take a look at the major stocks within the African region. Speaking of the Ghana Stock Exchange, Nairobi Stock Exchange, and Johannesburg Stock Exchange, we did see Johannesburg Stock Exchange down on Friday by minus 0.19%, hitting 75,712 points. On the other hand, Ghana Stock Exchange, I beg your pardon, remained unchanged at 3,195 points. The Ghanaian Stock Exchange has remained unchanged for quite a while now. And on the other hand, we did see the Nairobi Stock Exchange down by 0.21% at 92.24 points on Friday. And there you have it. This is how the markets performed from Nigeria and across Africa. Right about now, we will go on a short break, and when we return, the program continues. Don't go nowhere. Welcome back, and you are still on to Business Daily and Trust Television. On Friday, we did hear from the newly elected governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, speaking of Governor Olayemi Cardoso, where he gave an address at the recently held CBN annual address. And of course, he gave a list of key priority areas that he will be focusing on as the governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria. And I'd like to note that that was his maiden address ever since he ascended the post of the CBN governor. And joining me now to dissect his maiden interaction since he became governor is a professor of economics who will be giving us insight into the key policy areas the governor listed on Friday. And so I'm joined now by Professor of Economics. He is Mike Obadan. Thank you, Prof, for joining us on the program this morning.
Thank you very much, Chamaka. It's my great pleasure to be with you.
Let's start with you giving us what, in your own opinion, are the key highlights of that speech. Having listened to the governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, what were the key highlights of that speech from your own point of view?
Well, thank you very much. The high points are many. First of all, it provided a good review of developments in the global economy, and then the impact of such developments. For example, the phenomenon of global, economic shocks, the war between Russia and Ukraine, the COVID-19 pandemic, and then even the current Israeli-Palestinian war. The latter there's a possibility that it could have disturbing impacts on the global economy. But the other shocks, definitely have had grave impacts, particularly on global supply chains in the area of agriculture, energy, and then the attendant impact on rising inflation. And secondly, the governor also eloquently, analyzed developments in the domestic economy, and then correctly pointed to, extant challenges of the economy, like rising inflation, foreign exchange market crisis, questions of infrastructure as a constraint to economic performance, low external reserves, and many other challenges, to the economy. But the issue of rising inflation and then rising inflation and the question of foreign exchange market crisis and the instability of the exchange rate, I think he correctly adverted to them, and the implications, for human conditions, as it were. And the governor also drew attention to issues, arising from the activities of the central bank. He pointed to the relative ineffectiveness of monetary policy instruments, and the fact that inflation had been rising. In other words, that such instruments had not been able to accomplish the objectives of monetary policy, exchange rate policy. And consequently, he and his team have focused on fixing the monetary transmission mechanism, which means that their perception of the challenge is the inadequacy, of the monetary transmission mechanism. And they have started to fix it, as it were. But I think one important thing that must be bear in mind here is that, yes, the transmission mechanism may have, some weaknesses, but fixing it and without fixing the other issues, addressing the other issues that have made monetary policy, ineffective, particularly in addressing the bugbear of inflation. They must be identified. Such issues, factors must be identified, particularly arising from fiscal dominance. So I think the bank doesn't appear to appreciate the impact of such factors. The global economy he reviewed, he correctly analyzed that inflation is declining in many other countries, the advanced economies, and then some emerging and developing economies, arising from the efficacy of monetary policy actions, in particular or specifically tightening of monetary policy. But you see, Nigeria and a few other countries, which he also mentioned, Argentina, Turkey, have also implemented a tightening monetary policy, but their inflation rates have continued to rise. The implication of that, for me, is that in Nigeria and these other two countries and a few others, the significance of non-monetary factors must be taken cognizance of if we have to address the phenomenon of inflation. The governor indicated that the bank is maintaining tight monetary policy stance. But if the tightening had not been effective in the past, how are we sure now that further tightening?
Thank you, Prof, for that high-level summary you've given us so far. There was something the CBN governor said that indeed struck on the minds of most economic watchers. He said the CBN will currently be moving away from the way it has been acting, and will move on now to the orthodox monetary policy responsibility that it has been given. What do you make of that?
Well, let me say that, or acknowledge that reservations have been expressed on the development finance interventions, which is a major plank of unorthodox monetary policy action. And to say that, yes, he is right in a way to say that, the bank will be moving away from it. But I will appeal that, and urge that, the management should not move completely away from unorthodox policy actions. Sticking strictly to orthodox monetary policy instruments, which we know have limitations in Nigeria's circumstance, will mean, sticking to the pure IMF policy of seeing a central bank's role as balancing the books and not necessarily contributing meaningfully to development. And so I think the bank, would need to move away from development finance interventions. Indeed, the previous management had already stated clearly that it was winding down on the various development finance interventions. There are some of those interventions that aid development of the private sector. For example, I give you, the issue of the discriminatory cash reserve requirement policy, initiative through which the central bank allows commercial banks to take money from their reserves in the central bank and lend, to big business buckets, which impact heavily on the economy at low interest rates. The central bank does not take risk in such lending. It's the commercial banks that do their due diligence and then lend money to various sectors of the economy, particularly the industrial sector. I think such initiatives should not be ruled out from financing by the central bank. Perhaps non-core, projects could be, wound down. I think they should take a critical look and be selective in winding down the development finance interventions. Such interventions actually aided the economy, to exit the first recession, which was had in 2016 to 2017.
Let's talk about the recapitalization of deposit money banks. I remember the last time we saw something like this play out was during the Soludo era. But we have seen or have heard from the current administration of the Central Bank of Nigeria talking about recapitalizing the deposit money banks. But what would this action have on investors and investors' confidence, not just within Nigeria, but across the world?
Well, thank you very much for that important question. The recapitalization will actually boost the confidence of investors, boost the confidence of depositors. The need to recapitalize the banks at this point in time is there. Given the various shocks, global and domestic, to the economy, you find that such shocks have imposed stresses, on commercial banks, particularly the issue of rising inflation and then depreciating exchange rate. These have tended to burden the commercial banks in terms of more accumulation of non-performing loans, particularly for banks that are exposed to foreign creditors. The depreciation, burdens them significantly. And so it means then that such banks and many others need more capital, to reassure confidence that they have the ability to meet their demand for cash at any point in time. And the data available, even before the previous management came on board, show that the capital adequacy ratios of, all the banks, including the international banks and the national banks, had tended to weaken significantly, continued declining. So which means there is definitely a need to beef up the capital. So I fully, support the initiative to recapitalize the banks. And even the previous management had also, given a thought to it, just that they had not implemented anything. So it's a good initiative to recapitalize the banks. So recapitalization will put the banks in a good position to perform their functions of lending, to private sector, real sectors for growth and development purposes. So I fully endorse, that strategy of the bank at this point in time. Although I will add a caveat that, as I've argued in the past, even during the Soludo era, that recapitalization per se, it will not be a sufficient condition for the continued good health, of the financial system, commercial banks. Besides recapitalization, the central bank must ensure good corporate governance among the commercial banks. Good corporate governance, which will minimize the incidence of insider loans, insider credit, which tend to be abused and put the banks in great difficulty. So that's important also.
Let's talk about inflation. Inflationary pressures was something that came up quite a number of times during the address of the CBN governor, which he said that the CBN will, of course, is working towards targeting inflation stability. He talked about the inflation targeting method that would be used. What do you make of this? And what are your projections? If this is implemented, what are your inflation projections for the remaining of the year 2023?
Well, let me say this, that even without, inflation, explicit inflation targeting, strategy, the projections, have been that given the way policy shocks from the exchange rate depreciation, from the subsidy removal, and the legacy constraints continued to be very potent, that even with tightening, that the inflation rate may rise up to 30% by the end of the year. And having said that, I want to say yes, explicit inflation targeting is a strategy for attempting to manage inflation. But, implementing it per se is not a sufficient condition for inflation to be adequately managed. Some other countries have implemented inflation targeting. Inflation, have been managed at some point, effectively managed, but in recent years, it had not been so. Explicit inflation targeting simply means that the bank and government would jointly agree on an inflation target. And in a way, we've been having that in Nigeria every year during the budget. A target inflation is, indicated by government. What is important is not just setting the target, but taking the measures, implementing the strategies that will enable the government to rein in inflation. You set an inflation target explicitly. You announce to the public that this is what you have set. And, you work towards it by implementing appropriate strategies, to ensure that inflation is within that target. And periodically, you also evaluate, announce to the public, what's happening to the inflation target. So if the prevailing conditions in Nigeria continue to exist, whereby the Central Bank of Nigeria is subservient to the fiscal authority, in other words, there is the phenomenon of fiscal dominance, in which event the fiscal authority decides on the amount of fiscal deficit to incur and what the revenue available to it, and then requires the central bank to finance the rest. If that condition continues to prevail, inflation targeting will not be helpful in Nigeria.
Thank you, Prof, for joining us on the program this morning.
Thank you very much, Chiamaka. Very much appreciated.
And this is where we draw the curtains on today's edition of Business Daily on Trust TV. You can catch this interview on Trust TV's YouTube channel, so do well to do that. And join us again, same time, same station tomorrow. My name is Chiamaka Nendu. Thank you for watching.